Okay, this is probably going to be one of the most valuable videos that you've ever seen when it comes to multimedia design production. If you take what I'm about to say in this video and you actually put it into practice, everything you make is going to be better. I don't think that's an overstatement. Let's jump in. So we're here in the Fusion page of DaVinci Resolve, and the one thing I've done is go to Workspace and uncheck Show Page Navigation, but we're not really even going to be focusing on Fusion a ton. It's mostly about how to, in general, make things look good, look better when it comes to design and motion graphic design, that kind of thing. So this applies for Fusion. It applies to other pages in Resolve. It applies to After Effects and Motion and Hit Film and Blender and all of those. Here we have our comp. It says motion graphics are my passion, and it doesn't look very good. But I wonder if you could actually tell me what doesn't look good about this. Why doesn't it look professional? And I think that's a big key to making work that is good, is understanding what makes something not good and look at the very specific factors that make a design just not as pleasing. So I'm going to break this down just from the most obvious start. First of all, this is black and white, and it's not that you can't make things in black and white, but it only works really if it's a certain style. If you just have a logo in white on black, that might work. Text just white on black doesn't tend to look really professional unless you stylize it a certain way. Now, I think one of the main reasons that just text on black doesn't really look professional is because anybody can do it. Anybody can put text on black. There's almost no skill involved. Something to keep in mind, though, is this is really high contrast. That means that there is a big difference between the brightest parts and the darkest parts of this composition. And what contrast does is a couple things. Is it separates your subject, the thing that you want people to look at, from the background, and it also kind of draws your eye to the place that you want somebody to look. So, for instance, if I were to take this text, I'll just take the blend down in this merge and take it down like this, then we have less contrast. It's less stark and punchy, and that has an effect on the viewer. It's harder to know exactly where to look because you don't have that contrast. If we were to do something like add a white circle, pretty much anywhere we put this white circle, that's where your eye would go. And so depending on where you want your viewer to look, you want that part to be the highest contrast for the most part. And this works both white on black as well as black on white. Same kind of thing. Your eye is going to be drawn to the area that's the most different, the biggest contrast, right? So that's not a big deal if you know that you're doing that. So we're coming back to, why does this look bad? Well, it's a really high contrast, but it's also really big on the screen. And so we're not really giving our viewer a place to look. They're kind of looking everywhere just because this text is so big on the screen. Now, we can fix this. We can make this so much better just by literally taking our text and taking the size down and pushing that down. Get this, okay? We have this smaller in the frame, and yes, it still looks bad, but this looks better than this because there's some semblance of a focal point. Okay, the high contrast area is right here where we want our viewer to look. And then there's area of rest around it. So it's not overwhelming. Okay, now to back up a little bit, this isn't necessarily wrong, again, if you know that you're doing it. For instance, if we were to take some other text like this and make this really big and black and white and stretch this all the way across the screen, if we were to cut to this in our movie, we can cut to say that it's, it's May, it's the month of May. And so this kind of graphic would work really well if it was like, somebody was waiting for something and waiting and waiting and waiting. And we know that it's March or early April. And then it just cuts to May. Like he's been waiting so long and it's a huge freaking deal. So that's fine if you know that you're doing that, okay? But having something great big in the frame that's really high contrast makes a really huge, big, bold statement, which isn't necessarily what you always want to do. So going back to motion graphics are my passion, this isn't probably something you would just want to say like that. It doesn't feel like this person is dead. It doesn't feel like the world is ending. You aren't going to be like, motion graphics are my passion. Like that's a weird thing to say. It's not this great big bold statement. It's just a fact. So we can take this size down like this. Okay. It gives our eyes a place to rest. It shows us where we're supposed to look. Now, in addition to contrast and size, if we look at this composition, we want to think about where this is on screen. If we were to bring up our guides, if I right click and go to guides, show guides, or I can hit Control G, we get these little crosshairs here, and we can see that this is not really centered. Really, it's not in the middle. It's not a lot to either side. It's just kind of slightly off center. And a lot of good design has to do with doing things intentionally, doing things that look like you are purposely choosing to do it a certain way rather than kind of accidentally kind of throwing something together. So with this, it's like this weird middle ground between having it perfectly aligned and having it off center. Okay. And so a quick way to make this better is just to pick one or the other. Either have it perfectly aligned or have it far enough off that you obviously couldn't do it on accident. Okay. So I can take this text and let's move this more towards the middle here. So now we have our text in the center and it looks a lot better because it's like, okay, they meant to put that in the middle. This is intentional. The other thing you could do is put this off to the side like this. And again, I'll just hide our guides here. Does this look amazing? No, but it sure as heck looks a lot better over here to the side than it did kind of awkwardly thrown in the middle. It looks like a bad children's book that didn't hire a professional designer, right? So over here on the side, this looks like you put it there on purpose. So we either do that on the side or we do it right in the center. Another thing to mention about this is if you're going to put something on the side, you don't want it so far on the side that it's almost to the edge. The reason for that is because it feels uncomfortable. And generally, if you're wanting people to look at your art and your projects, you want them to feel good when they look at it, right? It's not supposed to be an offensive thing most of the time. And so having something that close to the edge, it makes it feel like this composition is going to like fall off the edge. It doesn't feel balanced. You can think about it as if this text had weight to it, right? And it was on kind of a teeter-totter, right? In the middle, everything's balanced. If it's over to the edge, the teeter-totter starts to go like this a little bit, but when it's way, way, way off the edge like this, then it's just bloop and it dumps it off the side. And so you want there to be some space between the outer part of your subject, especially your text, and the edge. And that's mostly because of balance. It's also because, again, of the kind of focal point and rest thing for your eyes. If it's over here, it kind of subconsciously makes you anxious a little bit. And so as a general rule, unless you're breaking it on purpose, I would say 90% of the time, you don't want stuff that close to the edges. You don't want them touching the edges. You want them kind of a third of the way in across the frame or centered. Okay. Same thing goes for up and down. We don't want something down there on the bottom. It looks really weird. Even if you are going to have something, let's say this is really small and you want it really far down at the bottom, you're not going to put it way down at the bottom. That looks really sucky. You want it, again, probably in like the lower third or so, something like that. That looks intentional. It looks like you know what you're doing. And all you did was just move it a little bit. It's the same exact design. It's just moved up a little bit. I see this probably more often than I see most other things, is this alignment and spacing and space around things. You got to give stuff room to breathe. Okay, so you can really make your design better just by thinking about where it is on the frame, making sure that things are somewhat balanced. And essentially, the more extreme you go in one direction, generally I'd say the closer you get to the edges, the more of a danger zone you are, and the more you have to really know what you're doing in order to do that effectively. Okay, you never see like a Hollywood movie with their graphics off the side like this. That's a great indication to show you that this is important, right? Okay, now sort of related to spacing is the alignment of the text. Now, when you have something that's in the center, generally you want the text to be center aligned for the most part. And so there's a problem with this text in that I added some extra spaces here on purpose. So if we were to take those out, by default, this is center aligned, okay? So again, this is already looking better than it was because again, it's about the balance, right? So if we have these off to the side like this, it looks kind of weird. It looks like it's going to fall almost. It makes you nervous. But if we take this off, then everything's okay again. If we were to take this and left align it like this, obviously right here is no good because it's off to the side just a little bit. I would rather have it over a little more like that if we're going to do it. But really, if we're aligning this to the left, we should have this closer to the left, something like that, because we got to think about how things line up on this left side. If everything's lined up on the left side and it's closer to this left side, that's an easier way to kind of compare that things are straight, right? Whereas here on the right side, this and this are not lined up, but they're also farther away. And so it's a little bit harder to tell. So if you're going to align something to the left, make sure that it's kind of screen left. If I were to align this to the right, like this, we would put this more towards the right. And that's going to look better. Again, because of the same reason. We're closer to the right edge and the right edge is lined up. I'm not really going to put this in the center, again, because it looks like it's falling. So if we're in the center, we want to do a center anchor like this. All right. So we've done a lot of work on this already. This looks a lot better than it did. Now let's address address the elephant in the room, the font. Fonts, when it comes to design, are very, 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 very important. There are, in many people's opinions, a blacklist of fonts that you almost never want to use unless you're using them ironically. That would be a reason why I would use it in this circumstance. That's why I'm bringing it up. Comic Sans. Comic Sans. This is a font that is notoriously ugly. And the reason isn't necessarily that it's a bad font per se. For what it is, it's okay. With everything with a design, you have to think about it in context. Now, if we were going to make something like Jane's kindergarten class, dude, Comic Sans, probably the perfect font. Yes, there is a time to use Comic Sans. I'm pretty sure it starts and ends with literal kindergarten stuff. Like you're actually making something for a actual kindergarten. That's when you can use Comic Sans. If there's any other time, I probably would not do that. If it's for playtime or kids or crayons or things like that, that's probably the only time you would ever use that. Because if we were going to say Revenge of the Mummy, are you really going to take this seriously? There is no way you're going to take this seriously. You're going to say, wow, this looks like the least possible scary movie in the history of mankind, because it looked like Mrs. Jensen from Spring Creek Elementary made a movie called Revenge of the Mummy. Let's talk about some other fonts, shall we? Here's another notorious one, Impact. Impact is, I would say, a more acceptable font than Comic Sans. And the reason for that is because Impact is a little bit less specific on what kind of subject you would be designing for. You can put Impact on just about anything, and at least it's like somewhat believable. Like Revenge of the Mummy in Impact, it's like, okay, maybe. With some other style and things added into this, maybe. But Comic Sans, it's not going to happen. The main reason why you wouldn't want to use Impact is just because it's overused. Everyone and their mom has seen this font at some point, and it's honestly just so overused that it's almost distracting, right? It's almost distracting. Like, why would they use that font? Why wouldn't they use something that's a little bit more obscure? And then I can be thinking about how scared I am of the mummy rather than why did they use the font that they put on all of the memes in the history of the world? That said, it's all about context, right? If you're making a meme, perfect font, absolutely perfect. You should do it. Use Impact. There's no better meme font than Impact. The other notoriously bad font would be Papyrus. And again, Papyrus, not a bad font. It's not. You can fight me on that. It's not a badly designed font. The problem with Papyrus is that it's really, really specific. Papyrus would be okay to use if you are making a film about Egypt and you're literally talking about like kings and pyramids and things like that. In fact, as crazy as it is, if I change this font to Papyrus, it actually almost works. We just make this mummy. That sort of feels like it could be a mummy, right? Like the mummy's tomb. That sort of works. And so that's like the major big reason why you wouldn't want to use a font is because it doesn't work in the context of what you're actually talking about, right? For instance, you wouldn't want a corporate training, that's like your new forklift in this like scratched out crazy font. You'd want something like murder sauce, right? That totally makes sense to be in this font, but not like my new puppy. Unless it's a horror film where the puppy's like a demon puppy or something, you don't want to use that font for that. Same reason why you wouldn't want to use a plain font like this for something like a scary movie. Murder sauce doesn't make any sense to be in this like nicely typed font. This is new forklift territory, right? That's looking better. So it's all about the context when it comes to the fonts. So let's just say motion graphics here like this. Let's think about our sizing and let's pick a font that says motion graphics. A lot of motion graphics fonts, actually, it's nice to have a font that is more boxy in general because it's easy to align it with things. It's easy to think about it as it's almost like it's its own picture. So for instance, this font, League Gothic, maybe even make this all caps like this. Oh, see, this is looking really nice. One of the reasons is because you can see I can kind of draw a box around this, and that tends to work for things that you're going to animate a little easier because you can think of them as their own object. Whereas if it's kind of like spread out and, if this was something like a script font, you see how this font, it doesn't really feel like it's one big block. It feels like it's soft and swoopy. And so if you're going to use a font like this would have to be something where it looks like it's being written on, or it looks like it's on a piece of paper. It looks like it's like on something that is boxy because it just doesn't feel like it's its own thing that can move around and be animated, which if we're doing motion graphics, it's nice to have something that feels natural to kind of exist on its own. So even something like Amatic is really nice because again, it feels like a box. Here's another example, Dream MMA. This looks like a font that's, for an action movie or something, right? But it also kind of feels like a box, right? Everything's kind of lined up on the edges. And even though the sides are kind of turned like that, it's like italicized, it still feels like it's its own thing. Like you could print it on a strip of tape and put it anywhere you want. You could use a font like Lakers. And this is pretty good. Again, for something to animate on, a lot of the time I like to have it feel like it has substance, right? So generally a bolder font. So here under regular, I could do bold, which actually adds a little bit of texture here, which I like okay. But let's just go back to League Gothic here, size this up. And yeah, that kind of feels like it's its own thing. And this right here, black and white, right in the middle of the screen, looks pretty good in my opinion, because yes, it's black and white. There's a lot of contrast, but you know exactly where to look, right in the middle of the screen. It has good spacing around it. It's a nice size in the frame. It's not too big, not too small. It's in the center, so it's balanced. And even though it's really, really, really basic, it looks intentional. From here, we can even take this and do something like rotate it. And again, I'm gonna rotate it enough to where it looks intentional. I'm not gonna rotate it like just a tiny bit, because then it looks like I just kind of messed up a little bit. It's like just slightly off to the point where it bothers you, right? But if we have this slam like that, it's like, yes, that's intentional. Boom, motion graphics. Let's actually get rid of that rotation. And I'm going to copy and paste this and just put some new text here. And we'll say subtitle. Take the size down and put it down below. So up to this point, we've essentially had one message, one kind of big focal point, but now we have two different elements that are kind of competing for each other. And at that point, it's going to be important to realize there is a hierarchy of where your viewer is going to look. If everything is the same contrast, then there's going to at least be a little hiccup of where do I look? What do I read first? Now, for this one, people are probably going to read the motion graphics thing first for one reason. And that's because it's bigger in the frame. So if I were to take this subtitle and I were to push the size up and make this a little bigger than motion graphics, even if it's under it, you're probably going to read a subtitle first and then motion graphics before it, which is pretty crazy. So size is really important, and it's as important as contrast. And it's, I would say, more important even than the position on screen. So a subtitle, motion graphics. Again, if I take this down, you're probably going to read motion graphics first and then look at a subtitle to kind of contextualize it, right? It's pretty wild, just these little changes. But now check this out. If I were to make subtitle and motion graphics about the same size on screen, your eye is going to be confused. Like, what do I look at first? But I can influence where the viewer is going to look by using contrast and position. So if I take the position down like this, what's in the middle is going to be read first, and then what's under it. This is also because motion graphics is above a subtitle. But even check this out. So if I take a subtitle like this, I still think you'd probably read motion graphics before a subtitle because it's in the middle, and it's really powerful to be in the middle. But let's put this here, and then let's take the color and just take that down a little bit so there's less contrast. We'll just make this kind of a neutral gray, and look at that, motion graphics, boom, obviously what we look at, and then a subtitle. In fact, there's a point where you can make a subtitle bigger like this, and you still would probably read motion graphics first. If I put it up above, I don't know. It's starting to get iffy. But the thing is, a good design isn't iffy. So I wouldn't leave the design like this. There should be no question on what you look at first. You should always be in control of what people are looking at. And so to kind of do this, I would take the size down, take the subtitle probably down here. In fact, I would even take the size down a lot more, make it really obvious. Why not use a couple different tools to influence the viewer since you have them at your disposal, right? So motion graphics, a subtitle, beautiful. Of course, when we're talking about motion graphics, then we can use timing to influence the viewer even more. So we could have motion graphics come in first and then a subtitle, right? And so timing, if something arrives first, that obviously gets the attention first and lets people kind of sink in first. So we could do something like take this motion graphics and we're going to fade this in just with the blend. And so I'm going to go to, let's say 20 frames, and then go over here to where it says blend and click on the keyframe diamond right here for blend. This is like the opacity of this merge that's putting this text over our background. And then I can go to frame 0 and I'll take this blend all the way down. That's just going to fade it down. And so as we play up to frame 20, it's going to fade in like that. So we could have that fade in first, and then we could have a subtitle. You can take the blend down and turn on the keyframe, and then we'll go 20 frames in and turn it back up like that. So now we can play this back and it says motion graphics, a subtitle. And we're controlling what the viewer looks at and how they process their information by using timing. So these are really the basics. And if you can nail these things, everything that you do is going to be better. So let's take just just a couple minutes and add on to this and make this kind of a finished motion graphic, keeping these principles in mind. We want people to look at motion graphics as its own thing, and we want them to look at Subtitle later. And I think instead of having these fade in, I'm just going to double click on each of these blends to reset it. We're going to make this a really cool motion graphics design based on these principles. By the way, if you're new to Fusion, there are a bunch of tips that I would really recommend you check out in our Fusion Survival Guide. That's a free video course with the essential tips for Fusion. You can get that here or in the links down below. My gift to you, okay? Let's keep going. So let's take some of these lessons that we've learned and make this into an actual nice looking motion graphic. And that's the thing, is it doesn't need to be complicated. Really, I mean, as it is, this almost works. So let's just keep this really simple. When in doubt, keep it simple. And let's just maybe do something like this. Let's just move our background over. And instead of this black background, let's make this just a little bit more interesting. Over here in my inspector where it says solid color, let's switch this to 4 color. And I love this trick. I can just push maybe the blue and the green up a little bit in the top left corner and do a similar thing for the bottom right. I can just grab this eyedropper and just drop that same corner. And look at this. We just have kind of a green on each side. We could probably just call it good right there. That looks nice. Just have a little bit of character in the background. And notice I still keep the background dark. I don't have it really, really busy. Like this actually still works okay. The more contrast you get in the background itself, the harder it's going to be to have what you actually want the viewer to look at kind of stick out. And so, you know, the crazier it gets, the more you're just competing with this focal point. So it's good, just as a general rule, if you're not really confident in your background skills, just take the background up a little bit, but keep it pretty dark. And now everything in motion graphics should really be some kind of reveal. It's almost like a little magic trick, right? And so we shouldn't just have it cut to this. It'd be more interesting if this animated on somehow. And there are a ton of ways that we can do that. I'll show you a little trick that's really easy. And I like to call it like a drop in.
You just drop in and just smack the lip.
And how you do it is you just take something like a rectangle mask. So right here, I can grab this and plug it into my text. I could also probably just plug it into the merge. Either way, it's going to do the same thing. And we're going to put this rectangle right around our text like this. And then we can take the text itself and we can move this text, and it's going to move the text, but not move the rectangle mask. And so we can kind of hide the text just by pushing it outside of the rectangle. And that's just animating this center property under layout here. And so let's just go, I don't know, 15, 20 frames in or so, and we'll hit this keyframe diamond right here and then go back to frame 0, and then we'll just push this up just so it's out of that mask. So now if we play this back, this just pops down like that. Let's also give this just a little bit more motion, and I'm going to do this with the transform node. I'll take this and just drag this here under our text, and this will let me move the text as well as the mask kind of all together, because anything that you run through a transform node, it all kind of moves together. Okay, so we can kind of move both the mask and the text as a group and sort of offset them. And what we'll do is have this sort of click into place. And so let's say at frame 25 or so, we're going to keyframe this size, and then maybe I'll move this over to frame 15 or so, and then we'll just push the size up a little bit. So now I'll double click off, and let's play this back, and it goes clunk clunk. And so it sort of comes down and then it sort of clicks in. And actually, let's play around with our keyframes a little bit. We can go up to the upper right, and here where it says keyframes, I can open up the keyframe panel, and this is where we're going to see all of our nodes in our composition. And we'll also have these little graphs here for anything that's animated, these little tick marks and these red lines. And so our text and our transform are animated, and we can see this is sort of the graph of the values. And so let's actually make this go a little bit faster. I'll just grab the second tick mark and bring it to, I don't know, maybe frame 12 or so. And let's take these on our size, make everything a little bit faster. Let's just see how that feels. So it goes click, click. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So it comes down and then it clicks in. Now, one thing I want to do is make it so this animation isn't so jerky. See how it comes in and then immediately stops, and then it instantly scales and it immediately stops again. Part of motion graphic design is being careful about how your animations kind of speed up and slow down. And that process is called easing. So to mess with our easing, we're going to go to the spline panel. So I'll go ahead and close keyframes and go over to spline. And that's going to open up our spline panel, which gives us just a bigger graph of the animations that we have. Make sure that you have anything that you want to see checked here. And here we can see our animations. So we have one that's starting at 0 and going to 1, one that's a little bit more and kind of going down to 1. What we want to do is take this keyframe and mess with this handle, because this is going to adjust the speed of the movement for our animation. And you can think of this as a graph over time, right? So this is the value, and then this is the frames. And so for a few frames, we want this just to start going really, really slow. and then it kind of speeds up, just like stuff in real life. And then when we come to the end of our animation, we want this also to slow down and kind of gradually stop. So that's what I would probably refer to as flattening the keyframes or flattening the handles or the tangents. That's what we want, is this to be a nice soft S curve a lot of the time. And check this out. This comes in. Oh, it's already looking a lot better. We'll also do the same thing for our transform size. A quick way to do this same thing is just to select any of those keyframes and hit F on the keyboard, and that'll flatten out those tangents like that. And now check this out. So now this comes in. Oh, and it just feels so much better. Yeah, nice and easy. There's no jerky movement to it. It's just very natural. Oh, so good. So now we have the motion graphics kind of clicking in there. And again, just think of all of this as a magic trick. Like, what would be the coolest way for this subtitle to show up that isn't just super distracting and way over the top, right? We want it to just come in all stylistic. So right when this motion graphics pops in, let's just have this subtitle kind of pop out from it. Like this is sort of squeezing the subtitle and the subtitle has to kind of move out of the way. So let's do the same thing. We can either do it with our center of our text or we can run it through a transform. I think I'll run it through a transform. Most of the time I like to run things through a transform, but it's kind of up to you. Okay, so right here as we're finishing that, so let's see, we want this to be out by frame 22 or so. And so we'll just keyframe the center of our transform. This is going to adjust just where this entire image is, this subtitle. And then we want it to start moving out right as this motion graphics is kind of ending its movement. And so let's put another keyframe there and we'll just move this up sort of so it's under this text like that. So now it kind of goes loop like that. Let's adjust this in the spline. I can take this and hold shift and bring it to the left to make this happen a little bit quicker. I'll hit F on the keyboard to flatten out these handles. Shloop. Yeah, good. But we're going to do a similar thing here and have this subtitle not be there until it kind of starts moving. So this is really doing a very similar motion to our text, but we're just kind of doing this in a different way. We could also just make a mask here on our merge. It's going to be basically the same thing that we had earlier. So as this pops in, kind of pushes out that subtitle. I like that. One thing I'll do is grab this second handle and hold Alt, drag this handle to the left. That'll keep it flat, but it's going to arrive at its destination a little quicker and slow down a little bit more gradually. So just shloop. Yeah. So that's looking really nice. Again, this is so simple. This is so easy. This animation, you can put this on just about any project and it's going to look professional. You're not going to look like a noob because it has good design, even though it's not the flashiest, most crazy thing you could ever do. Let's take this one step further and just give it a little bit of character without being over the top. Got to keep it tasteful, right? Let's just import a texture. Just right click here in our media pool and say import media. Let's just grab something like this paper texture. I'll drag this down and I'll just merge it over everything. And we can either take a transform node or we can just rotate this here in our merge with this angle. Either way is totally fine, but I like to use a transform just so I know that I'm doing something. It doesn't hurt to put another node there. Doesn't really take any longer. And we know that we're transforming this before we merge it. So now we have this kind of subtle texture, and let's take this merge and switch this apply mode to something like multiply. Now multiply takes the darker parts of this texture and puts it over our title here. And look, it's kind of hard to see even, but there's a little bit of texture on this and it just makes it look not so plain without it being really, really noticeable. I mean, this is the difference. This is before and this is after. It's really not a huge thing, but it does give it a little bit of character. Now, if we want to take this up one more notch, let's do something cool. Here, right after we make our background, that's going to be behind all of this text. Let's make a little effect where, you know, when we have this text kind of push back into the background, maybe it affects the background somehow. And so I was thinking maybe like a little water ripple effect or something like that. So maybe we'll just do something like, I'll just grab a brightness and contrast node. You can do this 100 different ways. I'll do that. And then maybe we'll just push up the gain just a touch. So that's just going to make things brighter. So right now, all we're doing is just brightening the background, but we can limit this to a mask with this blue input here. And I could take something like this ellipse and just plug this into the brightness and contrast. And now it's only going to do that brightness and contrast adjustment inside of that mask. Let's make this a little bit more obvious just so we can see it. We'll probably turn it down here in a minute, but now it's only brightening that background inside of this mask. And let's actually switch this. Let's uncheck solid and then push up the border width. And now we get kind of like this little ring. And let's make that a little bit smaller, something like that. And we're going to animate this ring growing. So right here where it says width and height, let's make a keyframe right here. This is after our text has pushed back. So right about as it stops moving, let's say right about there, we're also going to make a keyframe on width and height, and we're going to put those all the way down. like this. We're just squishing that down. So look what happens. It grows that circle. And I think maybe we want this a little bit bigger. So let's just say width and height 1, like that. And we can also keyframe the level. So we'll also go to our first keyframe and keyframe the level, make sure that's at 1. The level is like the strength of the mask. It's like the opacity of the mask. And then at the end of the animation, we'll take the level all the way down. So it kind of fades out as it goes down. Now, I did this dumb. This is only like a 2-frame animation, so we need to stretch that out a little bit. We can go to keyframes, and since we have a lot more going on here, under these 3 dots, I like to say show only selected tools, and that will just show me the keyframes for whatever I have selected, which would be this ellipse mask here. And I can click this zoom to fit button, and to zoom in where I want to be, I can take this little zoom thing and just draw a box around this, and that will kind of zoom that in a little more. I can click it again to get rid of that tool. And now I can take all of these second keyframes here, and we'll just push this down a few more frames. Let's see how that looks. So now we're getting this kind of growing thing, but it fades out towards the end. So now we have this little bloop as it pushes back into the background. It has this kind of ripple effect, and I think that's still a little bit fast. So let's take this and just move it down a lot. Something like that. Now when that pops in, yeah, there we go. Cool. And same thing here on our spline. Let's again show only selected tool. And this time, let's only make the last keyframes flat like this, because we want it to start at a constant speed and then kind of slow down. Yeah, that looks like a water droplet. Isn't that cool? Bling. Yeah, cool. I would say this needs to start maybe a little earlier too. So let's take this whole thing and just move it a little earlier. Yeah, cool. The last thing is we're going to take this brightness and contrast. We're not going to have this so bright. Let's turn that down a little bit, keep it subtle. Also going to take this ellipse and make the edge a little softer. There we go. Soften that. So now we have this very subtle effect that just looks dynamite. Looks so cool. So easy. And you can combine any of this stuff to make really nice motion graphics, and you don't have to make them crazy. In fact, until you're really experienced with motion graphics, keep it at this level. I promise you, nobody's going to think you're basic or unskilled if you make really nice, simple things. Because that's honestly half of being professional, is knowing when to dial it back and keep it simple. So I hope this has been really helpful for you if you're new to motion graphics. If you don't know me, my name's Casey, and I like to teach people how to use Fusion. I have a ton of videos here on YouTube, as well as some really in-depth courses. And if you're new to Fusion, make sure to check out the Fusion Survival Guide. That goes over the essential tips, the things that are going to make your life so much easier if you're new to Fusion. So check that out. It's a free video course. It's my gift to you just for being awesome. Okay? Hey, if this was helpful, let me know in the comments, please. That would be the best. Okay? And if you want more goodness, watch this video because it's going to be great for you. All right? Hey, okay. That sounds wonderful.